following the beatitudes. Remember last week we studied the beatitudes, and I was thinking about that early this morning again. What a strange way for someone to begin a public address, especially knowing his audience. There were early rumblings that Jesus might be the Messiah, and they certainly were looking for one. And when we get to the end of the Sermon on the Mount, we'll talk a little bit about this statement where they were amazed at what they heard when they heard Jesus. In the Sermon on the Mount, there's nothing political. There's nothing military. None of that's there. And I am certain that part of the amazement is they were just shocked to hear this kind of teaching. Not only that, he's in a wide public setting where a lot of people get to hear him. And he doesn't, and he's in a rabbinic teaching mode. He doesn't quote as authority any of the rabbis. And again, that may have been completely new for his audience. The audacity of someone just to stand up, start teaching, not even refer to their messianic expectations, nothing political, nothing to do really with what's on the front page of the Jerusalem Times. I mean, it's just amazing to me how this Sermon on the Mount is not only spoken, but the context in which it's spoken. So we have the way he opens it up in the Beatitudes. Then we will look at the section that I want to call Salt and Light. Then we'll look at the fulfillment of the law, chapter 5, 17 through 20. Jesus is going to address, and we'll look at this entire matter that he talks about murder, but even the deeper issues at stake. He's going to also address marriage, adultery, and divorce. And we'll look at those text verses when we get there. He talks about oaths, taking an oath. Eye for an eye, chapter 5, 38 to 42. And then love for your enemies. That's chapter 5. And isn't it interesting? All these different topics that he's going to address. Let's look at salt and light. You are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its saltiness, how can it be made salty again? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled by men. It's interesting. I spent a little bit of time this past week just looking up and becoming familiar with the ancient salt industry. It was a fascinating thing if you had an opportunity to read about that and be aware of it. In many places over in the Mediterranean world, often slaves and criminals were the ones sent into the salt mine. Have you ever, and this was an expression several years ago, when I first entered into ministry, on occasions, and periodically, I would get together with other ministers for a one-day retreat, prayer, that sort of thing. And one of the guys that would always lead the retreat had this expression, and I had never heard it until then, but over the years it's been an interesting one to appropriate. When we get done with the retreat, he would say, okay, back to the salt mines. I'm like, where did that come from? I didn't hear that growing up. So then that's when I began to do a little bit of research. Wow, okay. So that means I'm a slave and a criminal, back to the salt mines. Hard work. And apparently, a little bit of what I had read was that there were a lot of people that died in the salt mines. It was a horrific kind of industry to be working in. But salt in the ancient world was a little bit coarser in how people got it than you and I getting it out of the salt shaker. And that's why in some places, when you have the salt mixed with earth and it just really wasn't that useful, people would just throw it down and it would become sort of like pavement. And that's why he talks about this being thrown out and trampled by men. But you are the salt of the earth. It's interesting. Have you heard people use that metaphor about other people? Like, oh, they were just the salt of the earth. Well, I wonder, a lot of times what we mean by that is they live such a good life and they impact a lot of people in a lot of ways. This idea of salt of the earth is talking about influence. What happens if you are out eating at the restaurant and you get too much salt? One time I met my youngest daughter from Chattanooga at dinner, and Amber and I had what was it? One of my favorite, they're hard to find. I love blackened orange roughy as a fish. It's not too many places carry that, but here we are eating our dinner, and I get ready to take a bite. I was like, whoa. It's like somebody dumped the whole box of salt on it. I thought, is it just me? So I had my daughter take a bite of my fish. She's like, Dad, you can't eat this. I said, I know. So I thought, I got to call the manager. So, you call the manager over and you say, now, I don't want to complain, but I can't even eat this. He said, really? So I said, take a bite of it. He goes, no. I said, I trust you. I said, well, I've never had anything like this before. So I got a free dinner, and he even brought me a free dessert, all because somebody back in the kitchen dumped a whole box of salt on it. But we have had experiences. We know the influence of salt, okay? So Jesus is going to appropriate this to talk about influence. Now, remember what I mentioned earlier. In the Sermon on the Mount, he's not political. He doesn't deal with a lot of those issues of the day. What Jesus does do, you're going to see that even in the Sermon on the Mount, he's going to focus on the impact and influence of a person's life, right ethical choices, and relationships. He's going to get down to the brass tacks of interpersonal living and living for God. And this is where it starts. You are the salt of the earth. And I talked a little bit about salt in the ancient world. You're the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden. Neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. I meant to bring with me, I have a lamp that someone brought back from their trip over to Jerusalem. And so it's a clay lamp, and it's dated back to the 1st, 2nd century, about as close as they could date it. But if you've ever seen a picture of one, you begin to realize that lamps back then were interesting because you had a place where you put usually olive oil, some kind of oil in it, a little wick, and you just carried it with you. And this is why later on in Matthew, when we get this story about the bridegroom and the bride and the lamps, the 5 wise virgins and the 5 foolish, we'll talk more about that. But it's interesting, Jesus uses this as an example of influence also. You're the light of the world. See, I wonder, let's stop a minute and ask this question. Every day, if we thought of ourselves as functioning as salt of the earth and light of the world, and we consciously were aware of that, how would that change our behavior, our attitudes, our interaction with other people, if we took seriously that we are salt of the earth and we are light of the world? And that's what God expects of discipleship. Okay? Now, a city on a hill cannot be hidden, and neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. See, think about that. If you light the lamp, you don't hide your lamp. You put it where it functions. Put it on a stand. Now, notice he says in the same way. So here he's going to make an application. In the same way, let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise you. No, doesn't say that. See your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. Big difference. When we do the good deeds that we do, it's not to draw attention to ourselves. Kingdom living is not about self-promotion. And we need to say that more and more. We don't have to worry about getting the glory. If we do what God asks us to do, and we live as salt of the earth and light of the world, if people see that, God will get the glory and it will impact them. And that's all God asks us to do. Sometimes we make it harder than it needs to be. Okay, any comment about this section on salt and light? It's a short little section, but it has to do with the power of your influence in being a disciple. Very, very important. And I find it fascinating that Jesus sets up the Sermon on the Mount with this section right after the Beatitudes. I think it's very important that it's there. Okay. Let's talk about the fulfillment of the law. Jesus says, do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. This was always a hard verse to me, for me to grapple with. When I would hear from teaching when I was growing up and younger, the Old Testament's done away with. You know, we hear that expression. And then I would try to somehow reconcile that with what Jesus is saying here. Jesus didn't come to destroy the law or the prophets. Okay? That wasn't his purpose. His purpose was to fulfill the law. And this is why I suspect that you're going to see all through Matthew these key places where Jesus is come and he makes significant statements about fulfilling Scripture, fulfilling the will of God. Notice that he refers to the Hebrew Scriptures with the term law and the prophets. Now, that doesn't include everything individually, of course. It sort of leaves out the historical sections of the Hebrew Scriptures, but this was a phrase to refer to the Hebrew Scriptures, law and the prophets. And Jesus says, I haven't come to do away with the law or the prophets. If you've been here on Wednesday night, in the Psalms, we've been looking at 3 Psalms that talk about the law, the Torah. It is amazing in the book of Psalms, the positive attitude, positive portrayal of the Torah that is there. When Jesus is going to challenge some of the law, it's not because he doesn't appreciate it. And what he's going to challenge in a little bit later, just in the Sermon on the Mount, you have heard that it is said, but I say to you. And what he's going to challenge is long-standing interpretive tradition about some aspects of the law. And what he wants to do is get back to the original intent of the law. Now, that's an important thing to think about because that's behind some of what Jesus does when he challenges tradition. He's not, in some cases, not challenging the tradition itself, though there are a couple of them that actually do cancel out the will of God. In some cases, though, he wants to get back to the original intent and behind the interpretation of Scripture that is underneath the practice of the tradition. And that's exactly what he's doing, all because he has this concept of what fulfillment means. But it's not to abolish them, but to fulfill them. And I know in Matthew
there are 16 times, and I don't know if I wrote, yeah, I did. If we have time, I may go through a couple of these, but what I want us to do as we go through Matthew is, if we can, pick up on those occasions where Jesus and Matthew are both very clear about what is being fulfilled. That was a very key theme in the ministry of Jesus in Matthew. Look at verse 18. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, you may remember the King James, the jot and the tittle, not the smallest letter nor the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. If you've ever looked at Hebrew letters, if he is, and most likely he may be speaking about the law being written in Aramaic or Hebrew, but there is the little jot and the little tittle, and in English we would say the dot for the I and the crossing of the T. So even in English we're aware of those kind of markings. They're very small, and Jesus says, until heaven and earth disappears, not even the smallest letter will disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Now notice that phrase, everything is accomplished. It's going back to the idea of fulfillment, that there are certain things that are predicted for both the kingdom of God and the life of Jesus in his ministry. And the idea of fulfillment occurs when certain things are accomplished. And getting toward the end of Jesus' ministry, he will tip his disciples off, and Matthew, as the recording of Jesus' ministry, will tell us there are certain things that Jesus has accomplished. And so that's an important concept as we go through that. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same would be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands would be called great in the kingdom of heaven. I think one translation says sets aside. So the idea of breaking those commandments that Jesus is teaching, it could be just an outright rebellious saying, okay, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to do something else. Or it may be just the presumption of setting aside and doing your own thing. Just dismissing what Jesus says is irrelevant. And Jesus says that those who do that will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. There's this idea of being called least or great. Least or great. This idea is going to come up again when the mother comes along and wants both of her sons to be placed on the right and left hand of Jesus in the kingdom. Jesus wants to give them a lesson. What does greatness in the kingdom look like? It's not position. In fact, when we get to that narrative, Jesus is going to talk about what he's really looking for in the kingdom. Yes?
It's interesting to notice he says that whoever teaches this is not going to be thrown out of the kingdom.
Yeah.
He just has a lower status.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not, he doesn't have really a strong note of judgment here in the sense of being tossed out of the kingdom. But notice what Jesus is really concerned about. He doesn't want someone to come along and just set aside what he's teaching. And again, isn't this interesting that it goes back to the authority of Jesus, doesn't it? He'll be called the least in the kingdom. And he applies this in an interesting way. Look at verse 20. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees, the teachers of the law, you'll certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, there's been a lot of discussion on what it means to surpass the righteousness of the Pharisees and teachers of the law. And I think, from what Jesus is saying, it's pretty simple. You don't become more Pharisaic to outdo the Pharisees. You don't become more legalistic to outdo the teachers of the law. When you surpass them in your righteousness, I take that to mean by Jesus, because we've already talked about this a little bit. It means that when we listen to the teachings of Jesus, righteousness takes on a whole different meaning. See, if you restrict the idea of righteousness only to right behavior, and then you think that right behavior becomes the basis upon which I receive God's grace, then you have created for yourself a whole world of legalism. And that by the time you get through with it, you don't really need the cross of Christ. That's why in Galatians, Paul fights against this like crazy. What we have to do is broaden our view of righteousness, which means, listen to what Paul says. I don't have any righteousness of my own. It's what Jesus Christ has done for me. And see, we need to hear that more, I think. Boy, do we need the grace of God. Boy, do we need the righteousness of Jesus. Now, there is a sense in which we are righteous. We're made righteous by the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. We're in a right relationship with God because of what Christ has done for us, and then we have taken advantage and responded to that grace. But if you put sort of quotation marks around righteousness, that's the way the Pharisees saw themselves. And that's where, of course, we get the idea of Phariseeism, is that the Pharisees saw themselves better off. They saw themselves more righteous than other people. What's the goody two-shoes? You've heard that expression. Any of those kind of expressions you can think of is how the Pharisees were perceived by others, and they wanted to be perceived that way. That's the strange thing. So Jesus comes along, and you can see he's ruffling feathers here. He says, I want you to see righteousness in a whole different light. Now, how that sort of got transferred into some of our thinking is that, and I was guilty of this for years, thinking of righteousness as right behavior, and I was a righteous person if I attended church more than you did. Now here's where that really just knocked me off my socks when I began to pursue it, because one church, I had an elder talking about a person. Well, that person can't be right with God. They never come on Sunday night. And so I don't know what made me do that. I said, well, now let's examine this. Let's back the truck up a minute. So would you say you as elders have the opportunity and you have the wherewithal that you could say that we're not going to have church on Sunday nights? He goes, yeah, we could do that. I said, okay. Well, if all that's keeping that person from being righteous is they're not coming on Sunday night, why don't you just call off Sunday night services and then they'll be righteous? He did not know what to do with that. So that was the time of my life when I began to realize we got to look at this a little bit different. Yeah, Bill?
The law of Moses, I would think that this attitude of the scribes and the Pharisees, there would be, it would come about as the fact that there was always the priesthood between the common person and God. Under Christianity, that's removed. We can stand in the presence of God now.
Yes.
We are priests.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I would see that as a major contributing factor because for the Jews, they would look to the priest as the ones that would take care of the sacrificial elements and all of that sacrificial system. I don't think I appreciated that until several years ago. I made friends of a man named Dan, who was the prior of a local Benedictine monastery. And one day we were talking about some things, and he had some things going on in his life, and I said, well, let me pray for you. He goes, I don't know that I've ever done that. We're outside of the cathedral, and it's not in a service. I said, I'm not used to doing personal one-on-one prayers. I said, really? I said, well, from my perspective, I'm a priest too, so I can pray anywhere I want. He's like, So I know that he had to think through that, and you're exactly right. And that's how that's got carried down through the years. So Jesus then is looking at a whole new way of righteousness. And here's what we need to ask as we're going through Matthew. Can we put our hands on what that righteousness will look like? If it's not just making a checklist and performing certain behaviors and rituals so that I can be right before God and I can say I'm better than you, and use it as a way of gauging my righteousness over against yours, what is Jesus really looking for? Well, the Sermon on the Mount, as we're beginning to work through it here, he's going to give us some really keen insights into what true righteousness is. And what's fascinating is he's not going to talk about what we would think in terms of church order stuff, institutional stuff, all the thing that we could put in that big ball of wax. He's going to start talking about attitudes, behaviors, relationships, what the kingdom's all about. It's amazing what Jesus sees as righteousness. Okay? Yes?
Till that is still in effect today in some areas. A few years ago when I took a class to the synagogue, they assigned a fellow to stand next to us, basically to keep us away from touching their Torah.
Yeah.
And as the guy was reading from the Torah, if he mispronounced a word, this fellow would curse.
Okay.
And this was pointed out later on. Somebody said, well, why was he cursing? I said, well, first of all, and in his opinion, the guy mispronounced the word. He missed the jot and he missed the tittle.
Yeah.
Because that made the word mean something different.
Oh, yeah.
And he said, but why was he cursing? And I said, because he's not a Christian. It doesn't make any difference.
Yeah. If you've known anyone that's Jewish and you talk to them, their worldview today is different from a Christian worldview.
Which Judaism that
it does.
Dealing with.
It really does. And what I've learned is you have to be careful making sort of broad sweeping generalizations because, and if I ask this question, you know the answer to it. Would you want yourself be viewed as a member of the Church of Christ based on everybody else's behavior that's out there in culture who claims to be Church of Christ? Well, you'd say, well, no, not in a heartbeat, because we're all individual. People will say and do things that I wouldn't agree with in a minute. So we have to be very careful with those kind of generalizations. So in this section with the fulfillment of the law, notice he says, if your righteousness doesn't surpass that of the Pharisees or the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. This is why, I think this phrase is why a lot of people would say that not only the Beatitudes, but the rest of the Sermon on the Mount has within it entrance requirements for the kingdom. Now, Jesus never quite says that. I don't know that Matthew would even have thought of that. I would say more that when you look in the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, that as you look at the particulars with the attitudes, the behaviors, relationships, the English writer John R.W. Stott once said of the Sermon on the Mount, it is the charter for the kingdom, and it contains within it the Christian counterculture, that we as Christians live in a different culture. And I would take it not so much as looking for entrance requirements to the kingdom. Instead, it would be requirements for those who are already in the kingdom, the way I would look at it. Because I don't think Jesus is looking at the sermon itself as containing all those entrance requirements. Okay. Oh, and as we're going here, we need to continually ask ourselves and be aware, what does it mean to be great in the kingdom? What is greatness in the kingdom? We're going to find out that it's not what people think it might be. It's not about position. It's not about power or prestige or riches. I can give you a whole long list of things that it's not. Jesus is going to give some pretty astounding teachings and little illustrations about greatness in the kingdom. And it makes you aware he has a whole different view of the way things need to be perceived than what human beings typically perceive them. Greatness in the kingdom of God is different than greatness in the kingdom of Herod or the kingdom of Nero or anybody else's kingdom. And it's important for us as we go along to pick out those dimensions of greatness. If we really want to be great, what is Jesus looking for? And a very important question as it relates to discipleship. Oh, let's see. Just enough time. Let's cover this. We looked at significant insights this morning then into discipleship. Influence. Two metaphors. Salt and light. And remember what I said, if we really took that seriously, can you imagine what our daily living would be? Discipleship does not set aside the commands and teachings of Jesus. We take those seriously. The practices and the teachings of Jesus, and if we practice it and we teach others, that's what makes us great. And righteousness, in terms of discipleship, has to surpass that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law. And that surpassing means that we begin to understand righteousness from Jesus' perspective, and it's not about me, but it's about responding to what God has done for me and how God has changed me to be a disciple of Jesus. So we'll pick up there next week.